Section 28 of Rudder, Grange. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Rudder, Grange by Frank R. Stockton. Chapter 14. Pomona Takes a Bridal Trip, Part 2. "Well, no," said Pomona, "it isn't. His given name is Jonas, but I hated to call him Jonas, and on a bridal trip, too. He might just as well have had a more romanticer name if his parents had a thought of it. So I determined I'd give him a better one while we was on our journey anyhow, and I changed his name to Miguel, which was the name of a Spanish count. He wanted me to call him Jiguel, because, he said, that would have had a kind of floating smell of his old name, but I didn't never do it. Well, neither of us didn't care to stay about no dry falls, so we went back to the hotel and got our supper, and begun to wonder what we should do the next day. He said we'd better put it off and dream about it and make up our minds next mornin', which I agreed to, and that evenin', as we was sittin' in our room, I asked Miguel to tell me the story of his life. He said at first he hadn't none, but when I seemed to kinder put out at this, he told me I mustn't mind, and he would reveal the whole. So he told me this story. "My grandfather," said he, "was a rich and powerful Portuguese, a-livin' on the island of Jamaica. He had heaps of slaves, and owned a black brigantine that he sailed on secret voyages, and when he come back the decks and the gunnels was often bloody, but nobody knew why or wherefore. He was a big man with black hair, and a very violent. He could never have kept no help if he hadn't owned 'em, but he was so rich that people respected him in spite of all his crimes. My grandmother was a native of the Isle of Wight. She was a frail and tender woman, with yeller hair and deep blue eyes, and gentle and soft and good to the poor. She used to take baskets of victuals around to sick folks, and set down on the side of their beds and read The Shepherd of Salisbury Plains to 'em. She hardly ever speaked above her breath, and always wore white gowns with a silk kerchief a-folded placidly around her neck. Them was awful different kind of people," I says to him. "I wonder how they ever came to be married." "They never was married," says he. "Never married!" I hollers, a-jumpin' up from my chair, "and you sit there calmly and look me in the eye." "Yes," says he, "they was never married. They never met. One was my mother's father, and the other one my father's mother. 'Twas well they did not wed." "I should think so," said I, "and now what's the good of tellin' me a thing like that?" "It's about as near the mark as most of the stories of people's lives, I reckon," says he, "and besides I'd only just begun it." "Well, I don't want no more," says I, and I just tell this story of his to show what kind of stories he told me about that time. He said they was pleasant fictions, but I told him that if he didn't look out he'd hear 'em called by a good deal worse kind of a name than that. The next mornin' he asked me what was my dream, and I told him I didn't have exactly no dream about it, but my idea was to have somethin' real romantic for the rest of our bridal days. "Well," says he, "what would you like?" "I had a dream, but it wa'n't in no ways romantic, and I'd just fall in with whatever you'd like best." "All right," says I, "and the most romanticest thing I can think of is for us to make believe for the rest of this trip. We can make believe we're anything we please, and if we think so in real earnest it will be pretty much the same thing as if we really was. We ain't likely to have no chance ag'in of bein' just what we've a mind to, so let's try it now." "What would you have a mind to be?" says he. "Well," says I, "let's be an earl and an earless." "Earless?" says he, "there's no such a person." "Why, yes there is, of course," I says to him. "What's a she-earl if she isn't an earless?" "Well, I don't know," says he, "but I never havin' lived with any of 'em, but we'll let it go at that. And how do you want to work the thing out?" "This way," says I. "You, Jiguel," says he. "The Earl," says I, not mindin' his interruption, "and me, your noble earless, will go to some place or the other, it don't matter just where, and whatever house we'll live in we'll call our castle, and we'll consider it's got drawbridges and portcullises and moats and secret dungeons, and we'll remember our noble ancestors and behave accordin'. And the people we meet we can make into counts and dukes and princes without their knowin' anything about it, and we can think our clothes is silk and satin and velvet, all covered with diamonds and precious stones, just as well as not." "Just as well," says he. "And then," I went on, "we can go and have chivalrous adventures or make-believe we're having 'em, and build up an atmosphere of romanticness around us that'll carry us back to old Virginny," says he. "No," says I, "for thousands of years, or at least enough back for the times of tournaments and chivalry." "And so your idea is that if we make believe all these things and don't pay for none of 'em, is it?" says he. "Yes," says I, "and you, Jigel," says he, "can ask me if you don't know what chivalric or romantic thing you ought to do or say, so as to feel yourself truly and really an earl, for I've read a lot about these people, and know just what ought to be did." Well, he set himself down and thought a while, and then he says, "All right, we'll do that, and we'll begin to-morrow mornin', for I've got a little business to do in the city which wouldn't be exactly the right thing for me to stoop to do after I'm an earl. So I'll go in and do it while I'm a common person, and come back this afternoon, and you can walk about and look at the dry falls and amuse yourself generally till I come back." "All right," says I, and off he goes. He come back afore dark, and the next mornin' we got ready to start off. "Have you any particular place to go?" says he. "No," says I, "one place is as likely to be as good as another for our style of thing. If it don't suit, we can imagine it does." "That'll do," says he, and we had our trunks sent to the station, and walked ourselves. When we got there, he says to me, "Which number will you have, 5 or 7? "Either one will suit me, Earl Miguel," says I. "Jigel," says he, "and we'll make it 7. And now I'll go and look at the timetable, and we'll buy tickets for the 7th station from here. The 7th station," he says, comin' back, "is Pocus. We'll go to Pocus." So when the train come we got in, and got out at Pocus. It was a pretty sort of a place, out in the country, with the houses scattered a long ways apart, like stingy chicken feed. "Let's walk down this road," says he, "till we come to a good house for a castle, and then we can ask 'em to take us to board, and if they won't do it we'll go to the next, and so on." "All right," says I, glad enough to see how pat he had entered into the thing. We walked a good ways, and passed some little houses that neither of us thought would do, without more imaginin' than would pay, till we came to a pretty big house near the river, which struck our fancy in a minute. It was a stone house, and it had trees around it. There was a garden with a wall, and things seemed to suit first rate, so we made up our minds right off that we'd try this place. "You wait here under this tree," says he, "and I'll go and ask 'em if they'll take us to board for a while." So I waits, and he goes up to the gate, and pretty soon he comes out and says, "All right, they'll take us, and they'll send a man with a wheelbarrow to the station for our trunk." So in we goes. The man was a country-like lookin' man, and his wife was a very pleasant woman. The house wasn't furnished very fine, but we didn't care for that, and they gave us a big room that had rafters instead of a ceilin', and a big fireplace, and that, I said, was just exactly what we wanted. The room was almost like a dungeon itself, which he said he reckoned had once been a kitchen, but I told him that an earl hadn't nothin' to do with kitchens, and that this was a tapestry chamber, and I'd tell him all about the strange figgers on the embroidered hangings when the shadders begun to fall. It rained a little that afternoon, and we stayed in our room, and hung our clothes and things about on nails and hooks, and made believe they was armor and ancient trophies and portraits of a long line of ancestors. I did most of the make-believin', but he agreed to everything. The man who kept the house's wife brought us our supper about dark, because she said she thought we might like to have it together cozy, and so we did, and was glad enough of it, and after supper we sat before the fireplace, where we made believe the flames was a-roarin' and cracklin' and lightin' up the bright places on the armor a-hangin' around, while the storm, which we made believe, was a-ragin' and whirlin' outside. I told him a long story about a lord and lady, which was 2 or 3 stories I had read run together, and we had a splendid time. It all seemed real to me. End of section 28.